Raise your hand if you're captivated by superhero tales. I'm with you. I can't resist a gripping superhero saga. And my absolute favorite, the origin story. Just like Superman's journey from Krypton, or Spider-Man's fateful spider bite, or Miss Marvel's longing leading her to discovering a family heirloom activating her own superpowers. Every hero has a beginning. But origin stories are not just for fictitious superheroes. We all have origin stories that deeply influence who we are, how we relate to life, and ultimately who we become. These stories aren't just narratives. They are the very fabric of our identity, shaping our relationships and interactions with the world. I want you to close your eyes for a moment. Picture we're meeting for a coffee or a drink. Sitting across from you with deep curiosity, I ask you, what made you who you are? Now, not from a place of wanting to impress anyone, but from a deep place inside of you, I invite you to consider the question honestly, as an inquiry from yourself for yourself. What made you who you are? As you open your eyes, hold the idea. I was asked this very question, and I stayed with it. Over time, it unraveled. It brought to my attention who I thought I was and what made me this way. It was my own origin story. Every layer of it, every experience where I stepped in the role of a hero, a victim, or a judge, every relationship in which I identify myself with a label. Daughter, sister, friend, woman, philosopher, poet, third culture child, born in Pakistan, raised in Saudi Arabia, Canadian too, firstborn child, daddy's girl, only girl with 4 brothers. When I zoom out, I'm human. We all are. There is so much loaded into what it means to be a human, shared in social, political, spiritual, and scientific explanations. Each label comes with a story loaded with ideas of what is a good or bad way to be those things. With these labels, I identified myself, and in these intricately woven ideas around my own life's experiences is my origin story. Like every fantastic story, our stories have moments that stick with us. Deep in the layers of our identities, they embed themselves. They become the lens through which we see the world, ourselves, and everybody else. Some stories are cultural. In the culture where I come from, the expectations of what makes a good girl were clear and too narrow for my sensibilities. And then I grew up in a country that held even firmer and more specific ideas of what makes a good girl. In this context, my origin story is set with a conflict. Growing up with 4 brothers, one of my biggest and earliest conflicts with my parents was their decision to send my brothers to what I considered was a better school. In my little Ayesha mind, higher tuition fee, an international student body, better book cover sounded like a better opportunity. So much so, I overlooked all the things I loved about the school I went to. You see, the prevalent story about men and women in the culture made me feel less than and left out, unworthy of the opportunity to learn, which let me tell you was my MO in life. It still is. In these dynamics, you can see the story writes itself. And until I became aware of it, the story also ran my life. It presented in an insatiable drive for success, credentials, titles, stages, until I did it all and realized what story I was living, running about proving my worthiness. I was competitive when it would have been more beneficial to be collaborative. And no matter what I achieved, it was never enough. And if I made a mistake, I was inconsolable and beat myself up in brutal ways. You see, I had internalized the cultural story, and it didn't matter whether it was true anymore, it was true for me. How do you know if there's a story hiding beneath the surface? Notice the emotions evoked by certain labels and identities. Where there's strong emotions, there's a story. Growing up in Saudi Arabia in the 90s, Our grocery store trips were a real treat for the entire family. One weekend, my brothers decided to follow me and then decided to chase each other between the aisles. In those days, Saudi Arabia had religious police called mutawas. They would patrol around the city in random public places, enforcing moral laws. One of them found us at the grocery store that day. Deeply offended by our chaos, he zeroed right in on me and aggressively demanded the whereabouts of my father. The mutawa scolded my dad for his neglect of my whereabouts. He told him to control me and to cover me up. I could not walk around independently in the grocery store after that. Now, many years later, in my new home in Canada, I would leave my house with a light trench coat and dripping wet hair on my way to school on frigid winter days. My dad would plead for me to dress warmer and take better care of myself, and I responded to him by telling him to stop controlling me. He was just loving me. While the mutawa was the one to scare me, I projected the experience on my dad. In some ways, on most men actually. I was recently reminded by one of my brothers that they too had their run-ins with the mutawas for the length and style of their hair and t-shirts with cartoon characters on them. I was there when this happened, but it didn't fit my narrative that it was easier to be a boy than a girl, so I conveniently forgot about it until I was gently reminded. Here's what I've learned. If we're unaware of our stories, they can trap us in familiar patterns of securing the present and potential opportunities. We have a running narrative in which people play roles, and their characters are shaped by our perceptions and experiences, independent of who they are as people or their intentions. Memories are imperfect, often colored by emotions and incomplete recollections. So, when emotions surge, it's a sign to listen closely. Uncovering and unraveling our stories is important work. If the narrative runs us, we remain out of control and unhappy. But if we can own the narrative, we give ourselves the role of the author of our story. So, how do we step into this empowering perspective? I have created a 4-step framework that can enable us to take this perspective. It comes with a disclaimer. Each of the 4 steps is a practice, meaning you will not make a new choice right away sometimes, and that is okay. Like a car going 100 miles an hour, making a 180-degree turn can create a dangerous situation. We have to slow down to facilitate an understanding that gets us out of our own way. With that said, let's dive into the first step. Tune in. We must go within to uncover our stories. We must bear witness to our needs, feelings, disappointments, and acknowledge our natural desire for love and acceptance. As your story unfolds, take a moment to honor your efforts and intentions regardless of the outcomes. Forgive yourself for the past choices made in innocence. We all have things we would do differently knowing what we know now. Life is a process of learning, and mistakes are a valid way to learn. The degree of disconnection we feel from ourselves is an unacknowledged fact for so many of us who learn to see ourselves in others' opinions and ideas of us. Tuning in is how we remedy this and embrace the dialogue with ourselves, letting go of external narratives. This is uncomfortable at first, so be gentle and stay with it. After connecting with ourselves, we are ready for the next step, to zoom out and take a look at the people and situations that form the context of our stories. Like an eagle's view over the mountains, we adopt a higher perspective on our origin stories. Often, we see people as authority figures who let us down or hurt us, or villains who hurt us. In this step, we see their impact, but we recognize their humanity, the constraints of their beliefs, values, and their own personal limitations. We realize everyone hurts, and most people are doing the best they can with what they know. In this step, we seek understanding, not resolution. We recognize that while the past cannot be undone, with inner work, new details emerge that allow us to find acceptance and peace. This isn't about excusing bad behavior or violence. Rather, it's about understanding it from a place of inner strength and the safety of distance and time. If the nature of your story is traumatic, please engage a professional so you have the necessary support. With the inner and outer truths acknowledged, we gain the power to take the third step, which is to reframe our story. Having made peace with ourselves and others, we understand our tough experiences without being limited by them in the present. Yes, I grew up in an environment that made little Ayesha feel less than. As an adult, I see this truth and also the truth that the deep love, joy, and abundance that was a part of my childhood. Everything I love, who I've become, was nurtured in the rich soil of my childhood in Saudi Arabia. I am so grateful for that. I no longer have anything to prove to anyone. This is freeing. It frees me to be who I truly am and do what I genuinely have a desire to do. Which brings us to the next step. With this newfound freedom and courage, we are empowered to make a new choice. Dan Millman, in one of his wisest books, explores the laws of spirit through a parable with a fictional sage. The sage asks Dan to choose between two paths. Dan points in one direction and says, "This one." The sage repeats the question as if she did not hear him at all. Dan quickly realizes that to choose is to take a step in the direction in which we wish to go. So, we choose not with our thoughts and words alone, but by choosing to take aligned action in the direction of our dreams. All these steps need a circle of safety to hold it. This is your community of care. Some of my most profound learnings have come from shared wisdom of open-hearted and intellectually honest human beings. In one of my friends' circle, we gather around a bonfire when we can. We share our lives and stories, listen intently. We see each other, but we also see ourselves in the other. During one gathering, a friend shared her grievances with life, particularly her mother. Her mother had helped save her life when she was young and was in a car accident. She sustained a terrible brain injury and had to relearn everything, walking, talking, eating the ABCs. She said her mother suffocated her today, and life felt burdensome. On her worst days, she wished she had died that day in the accident. This evening, a new friend joined us and shared her story next. She shared that her son died following an accident where he had sustained a brain injury as well. He was only 3 years old. Despite doing everything she could, she lost her baby and spent over 18 years since then feeling like a failure as a mother. Hearing the story of a child who survived what her son had endured released her from lifelong guilt. Hearing a mother's perspective brought understanding to a daughter struggling to appreciate the gift of life and her mother's love. Both women found a missing perspective, one that brought them peace. I share this because we need each other. We are more of who we are in relation to each other. So hold your community close, listen to them, nurture them, allow them to nurture you. We are designed to live this way. In case you haven't noticed, the through line through all of these steps is extraordinary compassion. I say extraordinary compassion because the ordinary amount won't suffice for the change you seek. Much of rewriting our story involves reaching a level of peace with it all, with ourselves, with others, to recognize tough experiences without adopting them as our identity. And we can't give to others what we can't give to ourselves. So give yourself the benefit of the doubt. This is grace. Extend it out to others. Grant them their humanity, even at the lowest of their expressions. Our origin stories are living, breathing things, and they unfold in relation to each other. They're intertwined with the grand narrative of all of humanity. By becoming conscious of our stories, we can change our lives, our relationships. We can change the world. So, what made you who you are? What is your story? Who are you in your story? In these questions is the riddle of your origin story. And in these answers, you will find your own unique superpowers. You only need to want to be in the world in a different way. Life is sacred. We swim in compassion and grace and forget it is there like the air we breathe. Yet we suffer within ourselves, and the world is suffering about injustices of the past and wars in the present. Extraordinary compassion allows us to listen and understand, transcending the divisive polarity and judgments of who's right or wrong, good or bad. In this compassion, I can see a vision of justice beyond retribution, beyond reparations, and into the realm of rebirth. We need this. The world needs this.